We've already discussed groupthink, but I think it's worth just going over it a little bit at this point when we're considering exactly how we're going to be undertaking reflection. And that's because one of the things that you'll need to discuss in your reflection is how well you worked as a group and how your group operated and whether you've got their advantages or disadvantages, their diversity approach, etc. First, like examples of groupthink we've had problems. We've already mentioned this Challenger space shuttle disaster, where even though engineers had actually highlighted there was a problem with the tiles that were stuck, the heat protecting tiles that stuck to the space shuttle. Whenever we tried to bring it up with the junior engineers, they found it very difficult to face down the senior engineers. The senior engineers are the ones who seem to know much. You won't do your career any good arguing with them. So effectively, even though people had made notes and emails, etc., it was never dealt with because people did not feel like they could go against the grain of the group or go against the grain of discussion or disagree with the more senior characters. We discussed last time the Bay of Pigs invasion, where anyone looking back at it would seem quite ridiculous that this small group of people who had recently been kicked out of a country would be able to walk back in. But the Americans had convinced themselves, or the Kennedy administration had convinced itself, that Castro was so unpopular and that nobody in their right mind could possibly support communism, that anyone going along and opposing Castro would automatically receive help. What's interesting about the Bay of Pigs was that Kennedy was at least able to look at himself and say, look, something went really badly wrong here. And when they investigated, they came to the conclusion that the problem was everybody who was involved in decision making was too similar, was too much of the same background. Now, it wasn't because they were all white middle class males. It was because they were all the same. If they'd all been black females or Chinese transgender people, then actually it would still be the same problem. It wasn't that the white middle class males were wrong inherently, it was the fact that having too little diversity was a problem. I'm sure there are plenty of other examples from other cultures, just that the American ones are very much more available for me to use. And I think it's also worth doing that the people who planned these were Homo strategicus people. So it does relate to what we were saying in the initial thing of what is strategy. So basically, we're talking about this image. And again, the problem with Homo strategicus is that it is not diverse, it's particularly that they're white middle class males. So what are the symptoms of groupthink? What should you look out for in your group and look out for when you leave this course to become part of any group planning strategy, whatever? Well, look for first things. Look for illusions of vulnerability. Here the groups display excessive optimism and take big risks. Members of the group feel they are perfect and anything they do will turn out to be successful. They're not really open to criticism. The groups collectively rationalise anything. Group members rationalise thoughts, suggestions that challenge what the majority is thinking. So they rationalise the way they try to give decisions and reasons as to why others don't agree. And therefore they give a look for between them for ideas saying, like, actually, you're wrong because, and because there's a number of them doing this, collectively they can actually sort of produce some idea that the others are, anyone who disagrees is incorrect. This is what happened with the Challenger thing, that basically if an engineer came up with a disagreement, they're able to rationalize it away as to why that particular individual would think differently and be wrong. Strong belief in inherent morality. We like to say this sometimes, that you start to believe in your own propaganda, you believe in your own superiority, you believe in the righteousness of your course. And there's a belief that whatever the group does, it will be right. They all know the difference between right and wrong. This often causes them to overlook the consequences of what they decide. Outgroup stereotypes. The group believes that those who disagree are opposed to the group on purpose, a gross principle. So those who disagree aren't doing so because they think you're wrong. They're doing, as in like you've made a wrong decision. They're thinking because there's something fundamentally wrong with you. You are outside of the group, therefore incapable of taking the right decision. And maybe sometimes you're seen as weak or you're seen as evil even because you don't belong to the group. Tendency to direct pressure on dissenters. And this actually can be known to happen in groups. People start to threaten verbally or even physically and question anyone who questions the group's decisions. And also this idea, oh, if you don't agree with us, you can leave the group. If you don't agree with the majority, you can go on and can go do something else. You don't have to be part of this group. And therefore, it's either pressure applied to either get out or to agree. And this often quite leads to self-censorship, where people decide, oh, I'm not going to get involved in the argument, it's not worth it, I don't really want to get involved in it. You censor yourself. Censorship where they believe that if they're the only odd one out, then they must be the one who is wrong. And this can be seen in psychological tests, where if you take a group of people and get only one of them is not involved in the test, and 9 other people deliberately say the wrong thing, eventually the one outsider will generally tend to start to agree with the group to be part of the group. And you get self-appointed mind guards, people who think they are the moral center of the group. They're the ones who make the decisions, and actually they are the ones who will go along and push out people who seem to be disagreeing with the group. And this illusion of unanimity. And what this idea is that eventually what happens is because there's science that people aren't disagreeing, people just assume, well, that must mean that they agree. And so there's a kind of idea that the very fact you're not arguing with the group must mean that you agree with the group, whereas in fact, quite often you've just been pushed into science. You felt you haven't been listening to the past. You feel there's no point doing it. No point arguing about it anymore. So how can you overcome it? I think it's important that your group recognise this. What's vitally important is your group just doesn't think that, oh, we'll have a discussion and a vote, because that will tend to highlight those who are the loudest voices. You must think of things. One of the things that I think all the groups should consider doing is brainstorming. And that also means that actually what they should do is you should actually have a situation which everyone gets a chance to have a say in. Until everyone's had the say, you should not make any decisions. And you should have a situation which people are allowed to put forward their thing without critique, without argument. Another something, nominal group technique. Nominal group technique is a group process involving problem identification, solution generation, decision making. Step one, it can be used in groups of many sizes who want to make their decisions quickly, as by a vote, but everyone's opinion is taken into account as opposed to traditional voting, where only the largest group is considered. The method of tallying is the difference. First, every member of the group gives their view of the solution with a short explanation. Then, duplicate solutions are limited from the list of all solutions, and the members proceed to rank the solutions first, second, third, fourth, and so on. This idea is you have a vote and you have a decision making that's democratic, but you only have it after everybody has put forward their full solution. And therefore, and you actually, instead of just dismissing them all, you actually still have it there. This allows you to keep a record of the decisions that were made in the past. And if things start to go wrong, you can quickly go back and look at them, and maybe they'll modify this. You also might be able to modify decision one based on the needs of decision two. The second most popular decision, the one that you think is second most important, may actually then have an influence, and you get things like that. So the sort of the six thinking hats. The six thinking hats is a situation where you actually sort of think you either reality you can actually make the hats if you want, or then you actually decide to put a different coloured hat on when you're talking about it. And the managing hat is blue. So when you wear the blue hat, you're saying what is the subject, what we're thinking about, what is the goal. The information hat is white. Considering purely what information is available. Don't judge the information. What information have you got? What are the facts? What do you actually know to be true? Then put on a red hat for emotions. This is when it intuitively or instinctively gut reactions or statements of emotional feeling, but not with any justification. But you want an excuse to bring these out so you can start to think about them, take them on board. Because emotional thinking does affect things a lot. It cannot be ignored. You then put on a black hat and start to think about discernment, and you start to apply logic to all the things. This is where you're trying to look at reasons to be cautious, reasons to be cautious, conservative, reasons to reject the emotional arguments. And you have an optimistic response, which is yellow, which is obviously applied to identifying benefits, is seeking harmony, and then you allow creativity. You put a green hat on and you start to think, let's actually be provocative here. Let's throw out the obvious ones that we can disagree with, the ones that might be putting forward. And this is seeing where a thought goes. So also another technique, Delphi technique. The Delphi technique is a panel technique in which you have group discussion, but rather than having open group discussion, you actually do it by the procedure of typing up and putting in your solution. So you actually all write up your solution, but it's submitted to you anonymously. And then you read them all, you compare them. And the idea is that on the whole, you actually start to compare and contrast different techniques without being judged by the person who actually put that forward. It's often be used by a central thing who will actually take the information from lots of different places. So you won't necessarily know which one. So it might be one that will be difficult or not necessarily appropriate in this thing. Diversity of membership has already been sorted for you. You had no choice. And you also might want to occasionally ask somebody to play devil's advocate. So that you might have, oh, we all agree on this. Hang on a sec. One of us must disagree on it so that we can actually have a look at the counter arguments and see if anything can come up that seems that logic. So I think you should, as your group, you should do all this. I would also strongly suggest things like using post-it notes to write ideas on so you can keep copies of them. So if you're brainstorming, write things down on post-it notes so that whatever happens, you actually have all these different notes and content that you can bring up. So as I go round in groups, I'll sort of talk to you about different ways you might approach this in the next session.